Well, I think we'll make a start. We're just after 4 o'clock. Anybody else can join us, they can catch up. I'm going to bit of an amble through this session anyway, so not too rushed anyway. So just let you know we are recording, so if anybody wants to share the record afterwards, that's fine. We'll send around the link. For the duration of the session, if everybody can go on mute, that would be great. And then there may be a little bit of time for questions at the end, but the chat function is open, and I've got my really helpful colleagues Joe, Lisa, Rachel and Chris all helping me out with the chat as well today. So post any questions you want as we go through the session. We get a chance to pick them up at the end, and that'll be great. If not, between us we'll answer those questions and send them around. So this session is on culture, and I provocatively made that statement. Well, what is it? What is it anyway? What do we talk when we talk about culture? It's an easy thing to throw around, and I just want to put this out there. Just have some thoughts yourselves in terms of what do you think culture is. You can reflect on that yourselves in your own time. If you want to put that in the chat, that's absolutely fine as well. But it's such a nebulous term that gets bandied around so much, and I don't think any of us really understand what culture really is. I'm really going to just share my thoughts, and as usual with my ramblings, it's often just thoughts that I have in my head that I'm going to share with you guys, and you may agree with me, you may disagree with me, and I think that's really helpful. And if there's things that you are interested in what I've said today, or you disagree with, then pop that in the chat, because we're always open to learn. So my name is Nick Holding. I'm a head of improvement with the emergency care improvement support team, and I've spent the last 20 odd years working in the health service in a little bit of operational management, but mostly around the improvement world, improvement science, improvement methodologies, and working with teams to develop improvement programs and change programs. So I've come across this term culture quite a lot. Culture and behaviours are often intertwined into each other. And I've spent particularly the last couple of years as I've trained as an organisational psychologist, is really getting into what sits underneath in the world of change and improvement and organizational culture, and more about how people think and behave and those decision making. And I think it is that thing that sits all around us, but we often can't really put our finger right on what it is that the culture is, and those things that we just feel it, we sense it, but we can't say there it is over there. But still, I often will find that we'll engage in a piece of culture work. Let's improve the culture or change the culture. Like that's a thing that we can pick up and manipulate and improve, like we would do a process, for example. So culture is, for me, is all about words and actions, and the way that people exist and operate between each other within the organization. And I just love this cartoon, which kind of, for me, sums up what culture is, that it kind of exists around us, but we don't necessarily know or understand what it is or how we can sort of put our finger on it. It just exists around us. So I can't talk about culture without talking about, for me, who is the sort of godfather of organizational culture, and that's Edgar Schein. So if you want to go away and do any more learning about culture, want to read any books on culture, just type into Google organizational culture Edgar Schein, and you'll get the whole raft of really, really well-researched, good evidence-based organizational culture material. And he really sits for me at the forefront of the learning that I've experienced over the last couple of years. And Edgar Schein talks in a very I'm going to translate a little bit of this in a moment, but in a very academic way, he talks about culture being a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solves its own problems of external adaptation and internal integration. Bit wordy, but it's where that people have worked well enough to be considered valid, and therefore to be taught to new members as they come into an organisation as the correct way to perceive, think and feel in relation to those problems. So I've drawn out a few particular key elements of that I think make sense more than most, and that is the pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group. Those things that we just pick up from each other within an organisation or a team or wherever we work in, those basic assumptions that we know or feel about that place that we work. And therefore, when new people join, these are to be taught to new members the correct way to perceive, think or feel. This could be positively or negatively. You could come into an organisation with lots of bright ideas and those new members are very much taught that's not how we do things around here. Or you could come in with some negative ideas, and similarly, the team that you join can say that's not how we behave around here. So it's those cultures, those behaviours, and those assumptions that we learn as groups that we then pass on, and it keeps that momentum going. The culture maintains unless we do something particularly different. So these are the key words that I feel really come out of this, is the learning from a group and the assumptions and what we pass on to other people in terms of those behaviours and those words that we use. So culture, again, it's something that is often visible and invisible. I've worked with a lot of organisational development practitioners over the years, HR departments, and a lot of the organisational culture work will be framed around values, goals, strategy, visions, all that visible stuff that we see, and we try and create a sense of purpose out of what we're trying to achieve with culture change. So it could be policies, procedures, just doing stuff, and that's all the visible stuff. But the bigger bit in a typical iceberg model, and I think we've seen many different iterations of the iceberg model, it's the invisible stuff that actually is the way that things happen around here. And those are those beliefs, the shared assumptions, the traditions, the norms, the values, those unwritten rules and those stories that get told throughout the organisation about what happens around here. And again, once again, I don't want to frame this as being a negative thing. That can be really positive. You go into an organisation that has a positive organisational culture, people will be talking in certain ways. They'll be sharing positive stories. They'll be referring to things in a more positive way than those organisations that have a poorer culture and now refer to things in, say, a more negative way. So this is a non-specific description, not talking about things in a positive or negative. Often we have a tendency when we talk about culture is to think negatively, but actually a lot of times in terms of positive psychology, we want to also frame things in a positive way rather than that negative. So all those things you see in the invisible section, think of those things in terms of a positive relationship to those words as well. Something I picked up through reading the work of Edgar Schein was the different levels that culture exists in, though. And I think I found this bit particularly fascinating, and hopefully, well, I'm a bit of a geek. Maybe you won't find it as fascinating as me, but you know what? I'm going to share it with you anyway. There are multiple levels of culture, and culture exists at different stages throughout an organisation and across the world. So when we talk about macro culture, that is often sort of global. We talk about culture of a different country. We talk about the culture of a part of a country, a different region. I live in Shropshire, very rural. Some areas of low deprivation, but quite well off in terms of its location, but very green, and it has a particular culture. Some may say it's a little bit behind the times, or others may say that it's a very pleasant place to live. That's a macro culture of what Shropshire exists. And if I went into London, or maybe Scotland, or Newcastle, or Manchester, there'll be different cultures in those environments. Then you go into the profession. We all know about different cultures with different professions. There'll be a doctor culture, a therapy culture. You've got a teacher culture. All these different professions will have their own cultures. Again, these are macro cultures, but still we talk about culture as if it's a single thing, but this is helping us to break it down. Then we move on to what we would see as an organizational culture, and we all recognize this, the culture of an organization. Those of you who've worked in multiple organizations will get a sense of how it feels to operate in those particular ways. That could be at a hospital level, an NHS trust level across multiple hospitals, or generally an organisation, primary care trust, mental health trust, whatever organisation you particularly work in. I think we recognise organisational culture pretty much more than any other type of culture that we find ourselves. Then we sort of dig it into the subculture, and these are the teams, the specialties, the occupational groups and the departments within the organisation. So we talk about professional occupational groups as a macro culture. There is a macro culture, whether you're a doctor in the States or in India or Australia or in this country. There are also subcultures within organisations of specialties, professions, occupational groups. So you talk about therapists over here has a particular culture within their team. Similarly, doctors, administration assistants, people who work in particular specialties, we can all throw them around. What's the culture in ED? What's the culture in orthopedics? What's the culture in cardiology? We can all get a sense of those places that we've worked in, that has a particular culture, language, the way that certain things sort of behave. So it's understanding that once again, culture is not a single nebulous thing. It's about how you sort of breaking down in terms of understanding that the people within those organisations are in those particular groups, and then understanding that we in the NHS we recruit from all over the world, and therefore we have different nationalities in those organisations as well. So it's understanding what the culture is from those home nations as the people that come into our organisation and help us and work with us. What are their own cultures? And sometimes we don't necessarily always appreciate that. And then you've got the last level, which is that micro culture. This is those small groups. Won't necessarily be a defined team. It could be a group of teams that understand each other and work together, a group of individuals that work together. I'll put cliques, but it's, again, once again, there's a negative connotation to cliques. It's essentially a small group of people who sort of understand each other and get on with each other. And those kind of people that maybe catch up in the canteen at lunchtime or go for a coffee or may hang out after work. These are those micro cultures that exist, and there'll be a certain type of conversation that happens within those groups. And those kind of tribal thinking, the connections of the same people with the same like-minded ideas and assumptions about the world. And those are the less defined, really difficult to spot, but you'll recognise them in your own organisations, I suspect. So Edgar Schein goes on to talk about this is his particular own organisational culture model, and I want to sort of spend a bit more time on this one, because this one is more tangible for us as we can start to see things maybe that contribute to culture. And there is a spectrum from shallow factors through to deep factors, and those shallow factors, those artifacts, those things that we see around the organisation, the visible artifacts of as we walk down our corridors or we go into our different organizations, we see the visible structures, the processes, the things that are happening in front of us, very obvious, but quite shallow. Then the values, the espoused values, I should say, these are very much the espoused values of an organization, the things that we talk about, but don't necessarily always follow through as an organization. These are our strategies, goals, philosophies that are put together, the ubiquitous organizational values that get pulled together and probably get changed every 5 years, just because that's usually the cycle of events. Those deeper factors, as we've already touched on, are those assumptions, that those deep held beliefs by people within the organizations, which they very much hold to be true, and again, once again, they pass on to each other within that organization, or those teams, or those subcultures that we find ourselves in. So dig into a bit more detail about this, and this is the things that I think we can all have a go and try. Maybe after this session, maybe tomorrow, the next day, as we walk through our organization, start to keep an eye out for those artifacts of an organization that describe the culture. I used to do this quite a bit. Don't get a chance to do it as much as I used to, but I used to go for an artifact walk. Go and walk down the corridor. What do the posters on the wall tell me about this organisation? What do the notice boards? Are the notice boards up to date? Are they just filled with the last memo that was about 6 months old, but it's never been taken down? Are the walls just plastered with proclamations or statements or instructions or warnings, whatever it might be? What's the tone of the organisation? What's the environment that we walk around? What does the dress code look like? How are people presenting themselves? What are those? I walk down an organisation. Corridors, I'm obviously not going to mention them, but I walked down the corridor and I followed somebody just accidentally, and there was a bin which was not quite overflowing, but it was a bit full, and they put their sandwich wrapper in the bin, and it fell out, and it fell on the floor, but that person carried on walking. That's an artifact of an organisation which probably doesn't have a great sense of pride in their environment. And I looked around, and there was the decor of the corridor wasn't particularly pleasant. It was in the state of disrepair. There was a couple of buckets catching rainwater from a hole in the roof. So these are the artifacts that we see in an organisation. Similarly, you can walk down a corridor, you can go into an organisation, and you can see bright, clean, tidy organisation. That is a culture. The artifact cultural artifacts of an organization that demonstrate we are proud of where we work. We are enthusiastic about work. We want to present ourselves in the best way. So you can see all these things, have a walk around, see what you see. What are the artifacts of your organization? Something was pointed out to me once many years ago, and it came back to me as I started to do some of this artifact work, that we often see cabinets full of old medical equipment, or there'd be boards on the wall, particularly in meeting rooms where there's lists of previous chairmen, and they usually are chairmen, because back in, previous to the last 10 years, it was all men on these boards. But there's almost a celebration of this. These are deep oak notice boards with etched names in, going back hundreds of years. And you have to reflect, are these organizations living in the past? Are these organizations looking backwards in terms of their history? And looking back into history is good, but your history should inform your future rather than just referring back constantly. So these are the sort of things, from an artifact perspective, it tells the story of what the organizational culture might look like. Job titles are another one. Overly grandiose job titles, look out for those. Design of the workspace. People, particularly in the administration offices, are they all cooped up in little boxes, to shield them off from everybody else? Another one that jumps out, which I saw very recently, I thought they'd died out, but there was a parking space for consultants outside ED, special parking space. I didn't think those existed anymore. So you've got an issue with your culture if you're reserving special car parking spaces for certain professional groups. Even worse, necessarily, if it was maybe the chief executive, if you've got their own parking space outside the office, that you can draw your own conclusions about what kind of culture exists there. So whilst changing organizations artifacts won't lead to a significant change, you'll get an understanding, you'll get an appreciation possibly of what the culture feels like in that organization. As we go deeper down that triangle into those espoused values, this is what the organization says about itself. As I said, about those organizational values, the mission statements, employee charters, what's written in the newsletters of organizations. You can get a sense of the spirit, the themes, the feeling of an organisation in what they say, and these are very much those espoused values rather than, and we all know the usual statement is patients are at the heart of everything we do. So if that is stated and then it's followed up by actions that match that, then the culture is in the right place. If then the following conversation is all about money, then it probably isn't putting the patient at the heart of everything we do. One of the less welcome statements for me is that our staff are our most valuable resource. So meant in the right way, this is those mission statements, but staff being a resource, not sure that's an organizational culture I want to feel part of. But by the same token, if the staff in organization aren't treated well and looked after and genuinely put at the forefront and seen as a priority, then again, these are espoused values that people aren't following up on. And as it says here, so espoused values will provide you some insight into an organizational culture, and changing some of those, just changing the language a little bit, will provide a degree of change within that organizational culture. So think about how you talk within your own teams and the people that you work with. What are those espoused values, and do we back them up with behaviors that match those values as well? And then the last one, this is the really deeper stuff. These are these underlying beliefs and assumptions held by the organization, those things that just get said, how we work around here. This is how we do things around here. No point trying that, it'll never work. Or we've never done that before, so we're not going to try it. Those kind of things. These are the behaviors. Whether there's a belief of success or failure, this is a successful organization. We are a successful organization. We don't need people to tell us. We don't need a CQC rating to tell us. We just know that we are good at what we do and we are a high performing organization. This is about what people really think, or what people really think about within their organization, and those stories and those conversations that people will have throughout the time when they're working. So these underlying beliefs, these are the strongest indicators of an organizational culture. Those corridor conversations that you overhear when you sat in the canteen or the coffee shop and you hear the conversation behind you. I find that absolutely fascinating. And when I go into organisations and work with them, and I'm sat waiting to be picked up in Costa or wherever it might be that I'm waiting for a coffee, I'm always listening to the conversations that's happening around me, because that will tell me more than any presentation that I get given on numbers and data and the story that others want to tell me. The conversations and what people are saying and talk about the organisation will tell me more about that particular organisation. So again, once again, what are your teams? What are your people? What's the conversations that are taking place within the organisation? So wrapping, as we come towards the end, I wanted to just sort of touch on some of those drivers for culture, what we see, talked about how culture exists and what culture is made up of. But some of those drivers for culture often are the things that those relationships and how people talk to each other. And relationships have different levels. And this is some research that I was reading recently about. Often we're operating at a very transactional level one conversations. We'll talk to each other, we're polite, we're civil, we'll share the information that we want to share. We won't be really honest with each other. We'll just give enough information that we're working on a very much a transactional basis. And I see this a lot in change efforts when we're just trying to understand what is happening, what's the current state, and you'll get in a certain story, a certain degree of information, but not necessarily the whole story. As you start to move to a level 2 place, you're starting to feel a little bit more open and relaxed and feeling like you can share, be a bit more honest with the person in front of you. And then you start to really get to understand what's happening, and then you can hopefully work on some of those issues or those problems as we move through into a change environment. And you guys out there are working on change at the moment. We have to move beyond the transactional, purely professional transactional, move into that slight level of personalization. That comes by being humble, asking questions, seeking to walk in that person's shoes, understanding what it's like for them, rather than just a purely sharing what we feel. Very rarely will there be level 3. That will be that more sort of friendship, deeper level, intimate relationships that we have. Some of our friends exist at work, but most of the time we're operating in level 1 and level 2. What we don't want to see is -1 level. But we do see this, and I know there are people on this call who have felt this, where they're in this cruel, abusive, inhumane kind of environment where it's a -1 situation. So these are all the things that lead to a particular culture of an organization. Are we operating on a very personalized level where we're happy to share and give up a little bit of ourselves and be honest with each other, but also be humble to each other? Or are we operating on a very transactional, professional basis where we only understand to a degree what's happening within those relationships? Bias is everywhere, and we have to accept it and acknowledge it. But bias can contribute to culture with organizations. That the anchoring bias particularly is that happened once about 10 years ago, so I'm never going to do that again. And we all have experienced that kind of thing, that thing that sticks, whether it's us or whether it's somebody else that has that. The groupthink is a very much this is how we do things around here, and we all just kind of feed in behind that particular thinking, those blind spots. Particularly confirmation bias, we think we believe facts and we believe opinions as being facts and evidence-based. Well, not, they're opinions, but sometimes we interpret those facts and we'll take those in a particular way, and without really challenging ourselves and thinking, am I right or am I wrong? Or somebody else feeling like they can challenge me and say, no, you're not right. All this nonsense you're talking about on culture, you're completely wrong. That's an element of sort of confirmation bias. We rely in the NHS so much on data. There is so much data around that we often will interpret that and use that as our steer and our, to inform us about what's happening. That can drive particular cultures. It can drive very much that transactional professional relationship that we're just working from data. We're not trying to understand stories or what's happening in the background. And then that authority bias is that we always do what the boss says because the boss is the boss, and that's the culture that we have in our organization, that particular bias, rather than feeling like we can challenge or we have the opportunity to challenge, and sort of thinking more about, are we operating in an environment of psychological danger or psychological safety? And again heavily steeped in those culture behaviors. And we've heard a lot about psychological safety, and all these elements here feed into that. these are contributions to organisational culture. But what we're looking for is very much that learning zone in terms of the psychological safety and the motivation and accountability for people. We want people to feel like there's enough psychological safety that we can learn and express ourselves, but enough motivation and accountability in a good way, not accountability with a big stick way, that people can move into less about the anxiety zone where there's low psychological safety and high accountability and motivation, but also that apathy zone where we've just given up. There's no psychological safety and there's no motivation or accountability. So culture for me sits across all these 4 quadrants, and we can find ourselves in different parts of them at different parts of the day or week or month or our whole career. But motivation for me is really a really important part of culture, and this really feeds into something called, and I want to learn a bit more about this, look up the self-determination theory. The elements of that motivation is driven by these 3 elements, and I want to finish off these 3 particular elements, which for me are a huge driver of organizational culture. The feelings that we have autonomy, the feelings that we have the ability to act and challenge, where we have a choice and a willingness to do the things that we feel are necessary. Sometimes you have to seek forgiveness afterwards, but there's an element of you have a degree of autonomy. Take that away, you lose motivation. That impinges on culture. Competence. Do we feel like we have mastery of what we're doing? Do we feel like we're flying by the seat of our pants every day? That isn't competence. That isn't mastery of what we're doing. That drives a particular behavior and culture within an organization. And then finally, relatedness. Our connection with the people around us. If we have no connection with the people around us and our relatedness to those people in a shared sense of purpose, our motivation goes right through the floor, and we're just there to do a particular job, get in, get out, get paid, and job done. There's no motivation in that, and that drives a certain particular type of motivation. So once again, I've seen organizations in the high category and the low category, which have all 3 elements. And for me, as a driver of organizational culture, the self-determination theory, these 3 elements are probably one of the most influential contributions that I think can drive that, because ultimately it drives our motivation, and that is for me a fundamental part of an organizational culture. So I've rattled through that as really quickly as I could, sharing with you as much as I possibly can in the short space of time that I have. I am going to go through the questions afterwards. We have run out of time, and I expect people will be jumping off to the next one. Hope that has been helpful. I'll pick up the questions afterwards and I'll reply to any in particular, but even so, I'll read through them and just enjoy what everybody's been saying throughout this session. Thanks for joining us, and hopefully look forward to seeing you all again in a couple of weeks at the next Hive learning event.
Thank you. Do you want it today?